Greetings. I'm Jessica Milner-Davis from the University of Sydney. Thank you for being here. I'm going to speak to you today about satire at work, the case of censorship and its cultural context. And by the way, that cultural context is, of course, Australia. First, a word about satire as a style of humour. Satire is humour that is critical of its target. So it reduces the target to a stereotype, and that means it uses simplification together with exaggeration and, of course, incongruity, combining the target with something which doesn't fit, which makes us surprised, sit up in surprise. So the relevant theorist here is Henri Bergson, back at the beginning of the 20th century, who theorized how the mechanical, the artificial, when overlaid on the flexible, the responsive, the human, creates laughter. And he thought we laugh to criticize the target, we laugh to vent our feelings that we have about the target, and we laugh perhaps to liberate ourselves. But the whole point about satire is that because it's critical, it's likely to offend its target, and perhaps not only the target, but others too. So when satire occurs at work, one of the most important questions is, does it occur from those below, targeted at those above, or from those above, coming downwards? Now a word about the cultural context. Australia's traditional tolerance for satire and parody is very broad. We have a large cultural permission, broader than many other cultures, for humour of all kinds, in all places and at all times. So back in 2006, our Federal Attorney General, Philip Ruddock, who was not particularly known as a very liberal-minded man, spoke in Parliament about Australia's fine tradition of satire. And his Minister for Justice at the same time, they were debating a law in federal parliament to give privileged position in copyright law to parody and satire, spoke about Australia's fine tradition of poking fun at itself and at others, and how that should not be unnecessarily restricted. So if our federal politicians speak about this, I think we can take it for granted that there is an Australian tradition about satire is permitted. And that permission extends both up and down, and also, importantly, across. And I point to two relevant studies there by Huff and Weinglass in 2019, and my own earlier one, about how taking the piss is actually a way of acculturation in Australia, of bonding with friends and admitting new friends. Well, now about the reactions to using satire. Of course, you can get the traditional Queen Victoria, we are not amused, personal and social disapproval. In some cases, you can get retaliation, and not just by satire coming back, a mutual exchange, like taking the piss out of you, and I take the piss back again, and so you take the piss back again, and so on. But retaliation by censorship, and also suppression, and often that is done not necessarily by the person who is personally targeted, but on behalf of others. Maybe there would even be an appeal to law, formal censorship. And that is not always by the underdog. And that's the case that I'm going to speak to you about today. It happened in the company British Petroleum in Perth not too long ago in 2017. There was widespread anger and annoyance amongst the workforce in those days at very slow enterprise bargaining that was going on to improve their working conditions and salaries, while the senior bosses were making out like bandits with their stakeholders in the company, stakeholdings in the company, and their own remuneration. And a particular refinery worker called Scott Tracy, together with his wife, created satirical comment on this situation. He took Hitler's meltdown scene, a very famous scene from the film Downfall, directed by Hirschbiegel in 2004, and he subtitled it to refer to the ongoing wage negotiations, and then shared that with other workers and with union staff. So this is the scene. Those of you who have seen the film will undoubtedly recall it, and those of you who have seen all kinds of memes based on this on the internet will also recognize it. Hitler is in his bunker, he's being informed that he's losing the war, and the nervous generals stand around and he loses his cool. So the meme is this, and the nervous deputies, and Hitler losing it. What was the outcome of this particular piece of satire circulated amongst the workforce in 2017? Tracy was dismissed. His behavior was found to be misconduct that was highly offensive to management and inappropriate. Well, he wasn't going to take that lying down, not an Aussie worker, so he took his case to the Fair Work Tribunal in Perth, arguing unfair dismissal, but he lost. And that's the reference to the Australian Financial Review report of the case at the time. It took a couple of years, during which time Tracy was unemployed. The judgment was delivered by Melanie Binet, who is the Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission in Western Australia. She's a former industrial relations academic, so she should be used to thinking about equal treatment between bosses and workers. But her judgment is really quite interesting. Here are a couple of telling quotes. The Hitler video had the potential to undermine, demean, and denigrate the senior management team, and that was amongst an audience which they were charged to lead. The Deputy President could not accept that labeling something as a parody or satire is get out of jail free card and means that something is not offensive. So it offended senior management. Senior management should not be offended, and the Deputy President brought down an upholding of the management's decision to sack. Tracy and his lawyers did not take that lying down. He argued that the video was humorous, that it had no intent to offend, that in fact it did not identify the company or any specific person. The subtitling was general only. There was no Hitler is Mr. X at BP. And he appealed to the federal court. The federal court upheld that appeal. It was unreasonable, they said, to say that the meme had likened BP managers individually to Nazis, and he was allowed to return to work at BP. But there is always a hanging but in a legal judgment. BP argued that it should not have to pay full lost wages to this man for the 2 and more years that he had been unemployed. He should be penalized because he had shared the meme, not just made it and enjoyed it at home. I'm happy to say, in the spirit of a human scholar upholding Australia's fine tradition of satire and parody, that the federal court did not agree. They found that BP owed the full amount, wages, lost bonuses, so on and so forth. And so that seems to be the outcome of an interesting case. Okay, so Tracy was successful, but there was a cost. Even though he had been reinstated and had gained his lost wages and entitlements. And as the union secretary at the time pointed out, he had been put through very unnecessary drama. This judgment seems to strike a note with me, and perhaps, I hope, with all of you, that it's a bit unfair to dig in and drag an honest worker through nearly 2 years of stress and uncertainty. Why? Because a few stuffed shirts didn't get the joke. This is not good corporate behavior. Well, in the context of current times, perhaps the Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission was merely reflecting an emerging contemporary view, which is that stereotypes are somehow less than fully human and unfair. Well, it's true that they're less than fully human. They do reduce an individual to a thing or a cardboard cutout like Hitler, although, of course, in the full film Downfall, Hitler is a very complex and rounded character. But because of that, it seems to be thought that they mean that simply X equals only Y. This is simplistic and conduces to simplistic thinking amongst others, and thus it's bad. And therefore, we should avoid all such humor because it's simplistic. Well, does the internet agree with that kind of approach to satire and parody? As I stated at the beginning, Tracy is not the only one. Hitler memes on the internet have him raging, as my colleague Ben Nicol from Sydney University has pointed out, about everything, from all kinds of things, to Twitter outages, not getting the right delivery at home, to election results and so on. And the director of the film, interestingly, has a very complex view about these parodies, these memes, these takeoffs, these satires, these utilizations of his complex film for simplistic purposes. He thinks that the lines in many cases are so funny that he laughs out loud and finds that he's laughing about a scene that I staged myself. You couldn't, says he, get a better compliment as a director. There's a complex view and a man who can laugh at himself, and a nice contrast to the way that the Fair Work Commission initially ruled. To close, a word about offence and tolerance. This particular satire offended the management, but it also offended the first level of legal proceedings. I think there is a very important difference in considering such cases, and one that the Fair Work Commission really didn't pay much attention to, between hitting up and hitting down, because the public, not just the Australian public, favours the underdog. So hitting up, which is what this satire was doing, and not down, is much more likely to be supported by general cultural norm. So was this bad law not reflecting the Aussie larrikin free spirit? Whoops, there we go. Final judgment, I note, did have the law in agreement with popular culture, but I do think that that the whole case is a pointer, an alert, a warning to us of the danger of this emerging trend of over-seriousness and sanctimoniousness in today's culture. I suppose for humour scholars, the moral is that we need to balance mutual respect with the right to satirise what we wish. And in this case, let's note that the target was the upwards, the fat cat executive stakeholders. And here is the leading one himself, not identified by name, and why it was that he was resisting giving the workers a pay increase. Thank you. And I close with the references for those who would like all the full detail.